My name is Joyce Withers. I am 74 years old. I live in the same brick apartment on Willow Avenue where Leonard and I first moved after our wedding, long before the paint began to chip and the neighbors changed every other season. The window in my kitchen overlooks the street, and I like to think that after all these years, the street knows me too. My silhouette at dawn, watering the violets, checking for the mail. I have always been frugal. That's not quite the same as being poor, though people often confuse the two. My childhood was all ration books and patching socks, and when I married Leonard, we both agreed. Better to go without now than to ask for help later. So I learned early to save, 10 cents here, a dollar there. Coupons snipped from newspapers, secondhand coats, the smallest roast on Sunday. I became an expert in stretching leftovers and turning old curtains into cushion covers. There was a kind of pride in it, and even a comfort. My husband used to joke that I could make a dollar squeal, and I'd roll my eyes and put the extra in our brown envelope marked for later. There were so many envelopes over the years. College fund Mark, college fund Katie, repairs, emergency, if I fall ill. Some envelopes we used, others grew fat and yellowed at the edges, quietly gaining interest. When Leonard got sick, those envelopes became my armor, proof that I had prepared, that I'd done my duty as a wife and mother. We never had to ask for help. After he was gone, the world got quieter and smaller, as if the walls themselves were trying to close in. I learned to fill my time, daily walks at 8 a.m., a cup of tea at 10, phone calls with my sister on Thursdays. I joined a book club, though I mostly listened, and started tending roses on my balcony. The white ones never flourished, but the yellow ones, how stubborn they were. I grew to love their quiet optimism. My children grew up and away, as children do. Mark is 46 now, with a job in solutions consulting, whatever that is. Katie, 43, works for the city. She is always busy, always planning. Sometimes she drops off her youngest, Madison, on her way to a meeting. "Just an hour, Mom," she says. "I'll owe you lunch." They visit in spurts, arriving with their own food and stories, talking in that fast, clipped way that makes me feel I need to catch up. They have new cars, fitness trackers, holiday plans. They tell me, "Mom, you should travel. Treat yourself for once." But when I suggest using some of my savings for a cruise or a trip, there's a hesitation, a little pause, a glance exchanged. I have a pension, a small retirement account, and an old apartment that's worth more on paper than it feels in my hands. Most days, I live on less than I could, checking prices for tea and bread, buying what's on special, not out of need anymore, but out of habit. The thrill of a two-for-one deal is my little victory over time. When I go to the bank, I am always greeted by a new face, someone young with tidy hair and a business-like smile. They always want to help me set up online access, but I prefer to do things myself. I like seeing the balance, counting the notes, the reassuring clack of the stamp on my deposit book. I still keep envelopes, though now they're mostly digital, folders on my computer. Some days I open them just to remind myself, you prepared, you are safe, and yet there's a feeling, something soft and persistent, like a draft under a closed door. Sometimes, late at night, I worry, not about money exactly, but about being in the way, of becoming someone's problem. A week ago at dinner, Katie said, "Mom, you know you can always count on us. We want to help you manage things, make it easier." I smiled and nodded, but I wondered, not for the first time, if help is really just another word for control. Mostly, I fill my days with little rituals: tea at sunrise, letters to old friends, reading the paper and clipping out interesting articles, watching the world outside my window change colors with the seasons. saying good morning to Mr. Feldman, who walks his spaniel past my building at 7:45 every day without fail. There is a peculiar kind of peace in living simply, in knowing exactly where every dollar went, every hour spent, but there's also a loneliness that no amount of thrift can fix. A sense that, after all these years of saving, of holding back, of not being a burden, the only thing I haven't prepared for is being left out of my own story. And lately, with the way my children look at me, so careful, so considerate, as if I might break, I have started to wonder what exactly it is they want to inherit: my savings, my home, or just my absence from their worries. I brush these thoughts aside and put the kettle on. The yellow roses need watering, and the mailman is late again. Life, in its small ways, keeps going. It was a Wednesday when they came. Not a holiday, not anyone's birthday. Just one of those nondescript evenings that sits between the weeks, harmless and unremarkable. I had just set out the good plates in the dining nook, a habit I'd never quite lost, even though there were only ever 2 or 3 of us now. The table was covered with a faded floral cloth, its edges slightly frayed. I'd baked a batch of scones that morning. My hands still knew the recipe by heart, though my wrists sometimes protested. The doorbell rang at 6:15, as punctual as Katie's calendar. I opened the door to find her standing beside Mark, both of them in their work clothes, Mark's tie slightly askew, Katie's hair pulled back, clutching a tote bag that said, City of Opportunity, in bold green letters. They looked tired, their smiles practiced. Hi, Mom, Katie called, breezing in with the faint scent of her perfume and city air. She leaned in for a quick kiss on my cheek, then pulled away to scan the room, already searching for things to tidy or rearrange. Mark followed, giving me a brief one-armed hug. I noticed he didn't meet my eyes at first. Brought dinner, he announced, holding up a bag from the Mediterranean place by the river. Don't worry, we got enough for leftovers. I managed a smile, though something in his tone, it was a little too cheerful, a little too prepared. We settled into our old rhythm, Katie fussing over the plates, Mark checking his phone. I poured tea, careful to add just a splash of milk to Mark's and a wedge of lemon for Katie, the way they liked when they were children. The city glowed gold outside the window, car headlights tracing lines across the street. Looks lovely, Mom, Katie said, sliding into her seat. You really didn't have to make scones. You're always spoiling us. I shrugged. Old habits die hard. Besides, I like the house to feel lived in. They exchanged a glance, one of those quick, silent communications siblings develop after a lifetime together. Conversation meandered at first. Katie talked about the city's new recycling initiative. Mark recounted a mishap at work, something about a delayed shipment and a client's angry voicemail. I listened, nodding, offering small interjections. But underneath it all, I felt it, a kind of tension, like the air before a storm. They seemed distracted, waiting for the right moment. Halfway through dinner, Katie reached into her tote bag and pulled out a stack of papers, sliding them onto the table between the sugar bowl and the butter dish. Mom, we've been meaning to talk to you, she said, her voice carefully neutral, about your plans, for the future. Mark looked up from his plate, his brow furrowed with concern. It's just, you're not getting any younger, Mom. We want to make sure everything's in order, just in case. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. In order? Everything is in order. Katie smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Of course, Mom, but it's a lot to manage. The accounts, the bills. We just want to help. Mark cleared his throat and slid a glossy pamphlet toward me. We talked to a friend who works in finance. He said it's common now to have a power of attorney in place. Just a precaution. I looked at the papers. Legalese, dense paragraphs, spaces for signatures. Mom, you're not spending as much these days, Katie pressed, as if reciting lines she'd rehearsed. Why not let us help manage things? Pay the bills, keep track of expenses. We'd only use it if you needed us to. Their voices grew softer, coaxing. The word just appeared over and over. Just in case, just a safety net, just your signature. I took a sip of tea, feeling the room grow smaller. Let me think about it, I said quietly. I appreciate your concern, but I'd like to take a couple of days. They nodded, relief flickering in their eyes, as if they'd expected a fight. The tension eased a bit. Katie reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Of course, Mom. We just want what's best for you. We'll leave the papers here. You can read them whenever you want. After dinner, they insisted on tidying up. Katie packed leftovers with the efficiency of a woman always late for her next appointment. Mark washed the plates, checking his phone every few minutes. As they were leaving, Katie hugged me again, holding on a little too long. If you have questions, just call, or I can come by tomorrow and help you look over everything. I stood at the doorway as they walked down the hall, listening to their footsteps fade. Mark glanced back once, his expression hard to read. Worried, maybe, or determined. The apartment felt very quiet after they left. The clock ticked in the living room. I looked at the papers on the table, their corners perfectly aligned, waiting for my decision. That night, I couldn't sleep. I listened to the sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the creak of pipes in the walls. I remembered how Mark used to slip his hand into mine as a boy when he was nervous, how Katie would hide her report card under her pillow until she worked up the courage to show me. I had always been their anchor, their steady place. Now, they seemed to be planning for a world where I was a problem to be managed, a ledger to be balanced. I rose before dawn, made a cup of tea, and sat by the window, watching the city wake up. The papers were still there, pale in the morning light. I realized that despite all my saving and planning, I had never really prepared for this. What happens when the ones you protected start protecting themselves? From you? The papers stayed on the table for 2 days, untouched but ever present, a silent presence that watched me go about my routines. I moved them once to dust, then returned them precisely as Katie had left them, so as not to disturb their order. I could feel their gravity from across the room, their neat corners radiating a kind of pressure. The day after their visit, I tried to distract myself. I walked to the bakery on Maple Street, exchanging greetings with Mrs. Henley, who gave me an extra roll just because. I stopped by the library, returned a stack of old mysteries, and borrowed a gardening book I'd probably already read. In the market, I compared prices for apples, Jonah Gold or Granny Smith, and listened to the vendors' banter. I told myself it was a normal day, but everything had a brittle edge, as if I were moving through my own life in borrowed shoes. Back home, I tidied the kitchen, swept the balcony, and rearranged my envelopes, digital and paper, both. I sat at the desk in the fading afternoon sun, running my fingers over the column of numbers in my checkbook. Each line was a tiny memory. $200 for Mark's car repair, 2008. $150 for Katie's school uniform, 1989. $40 for a birthday cake for Leonard, 1997. $3,600 for a new furnace after that bitter winter. Some of these were debts that had been quietly, sometimes guiltily, repaid. Others, well, I'll pay you back, Mom, had always been just words. I learned not to keep count because mothers who kept score weren't saints, and I'd long ago decided to be generous without reminders. I thought about Mark, 16 and sullen, slamming his door after a fight about grades, about Katie at the kitchen table, crying over her first heartbreak, me brushing her hair and promising, There's always tomorrow. In those moments, giving came easy. That was what love was for, to be given away. But this was different. The power of attorney wasn't a gift, it was a surrender. If I signed, I would become an item to be managed. Joyce Withers, assets to be protected. Not a mother, not a person, but a set of numbers and signatures in someone else's ledger. The more I considered it, the more memories pressed in. Moments when the lines between help and control blurred. Last winter, Mark borrowed my car for just a few days and returned it 2 weeks later, the tank nearly empty. Sorry, Mom, meant to fill it up. When Katie needed money for a school trip for Madison, she borrowed from my account, promising to replace it on payday. I never mentioned that payday seemed to move further away each month. Once, years ago, I overheard them talking in the hallway. Mom won't need all that anyway. She barely spends. We'll have to sort it out one day. At the time, I'd laughed it off, thinking they were joking. Children being thoughtless, as children are. But now the words rang sharper. How long had I been living under quiet observation? My choices gently, invisibly, circumscribed. Mom, let us order the groceries. We'll get what you need. Don't bother with that repair. We'll take care of it. You don't need to worry about bills. Just relax. I stared at the legal papers again. The language was dense, but the intent was clear. A transfer of authority, not just for emergencies, but for convenience. Whose convenience? Mine or theirs? I tried to imagine a future where nothing was ever really mine again, where the key to my apartment could be taken for my own good, my savings monitored, my choices subject to committee. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, the city's distant sounds leaking through the window. A siren, a barking dog, the gentle whoosh of a passing car. Memories drifted in. Leonard's gentle snore, the baby's first cries, the endless lists of groceries and bills, all those nights I'd lain awake worrying, planning, making sure. It was always for them. But who was watching out for me? At 3 a.m., I rose and put on the kettle, listening to its soft whistle. I pulled out my folders, statements, wills, account passwords written in careful block letters, just in case. I sorted and resorted them, letting my hands move while my mind wandered. A strange resolve took hold, built not from anger, but from a kind of clarity. I was not done being myself. I had the right to finish what I'd started, to decide even now what happened to my life's work. I could choose generosity, but on my own terms. I remembered a story I'd read in the paper months ago about a fund that helped older women start small businesses, bakeries, tailoring shops, vegetable stands, women like me who had spent their lives giving, scraping, surviving. Maybe it was time to put my savings where my heart truly was, not into waiting for my children to spend it, but into giving it a second life. The first gray light crept across the windowsill. I felt a tired kind of peace settle over me, the way it does when you've finally made up your mind after too many restless nights. I stacked the papers, not the ones Mark and Katie brought, but my own, the ones that proved I was still in charge. It was time to act, quietly but with purpose. As the sun rose, the yellow roses on my balcony opened one by one. I stood, stretched my stiff legs, and prepared for the next day. The morning after my sleepless night, the city was still and pale, fog wrapped around the rooftops like a half-remembered dream. I took my time with breakfast, a soft-boiled egg, brown toast, strong tea, letting my mind rest in the silence. The legal papers sat on the kitchen table, but today I didn't touch them. Today I had my own plans. By 9 o'clock, I dressed carefully, choosing a charcoal skirt and a blue wool cardigan, pinning on the silver brooch Leonard once gave me for our 30th anniversary. The brooch was shaped like a swallow in flight. I glanced in the mirror, smoothing my hair, and caught a flash of the woman I'd once been. Confident, brisk, nobody's fool. I left the apartment tidy, bed made, dishes washed, the faintest hint of rosewater in the hallway. I was halfway down the block before I realized I was humming an old tune from childhood, something light and defiant. The law office was only 3 stops away on the number 12 bus, but I walked the distance, wanting the time to think and to steady myself. The morning was cool and damp, the sidewalk spattered with yesterday's rain. I passed the bakery, inhaling the scent of cinnamon and yeast, and wondered who'd opened up so early. A young woman stood in the doorway, sweeping out crumbs, her hair tied back, her hands quick and practiced. I nodded a greeting, and she smiled, tired but proud. The law office was in a brick building beside the post office, wedged between a pharmacy and a nail salon. The glass door gleamed, and the small brass plaque read, Brown and Myers, Attorneys at Law. Appointments preferred. Inside, the reception area was warm, carpeted, walls lined with certificates and landscape prints, mountains, rivers, open roads. The receptionist, a woman in her 30s with a neat bun and kind eyes, looked up from her computer and greeted me by name. Mrs. Withers, you're right on time. Mr. Myers will see you in a moment. I sat in the waiting area, smoothing my skirt, clutching my folder. The chair was sturdy and comfortable, upholstered in green tweed. I took a breath and let my gaze wander over the room. A basket of magazines, a clock shaped like a sunburst, a vase of fresh tulips. I tried to imagine what it would be like to come here in distress, after a death, a divorce, a terrible argument. But I wasn't here for any of those things. I was here to draw a line, quietly and gently, before someone else did it for me. Mr. Myers was not a young man, though younger than me by a fair margin. He wore glasses and a blue shirt, and he rose as I entered, shaking my hand with practiced warmth. It's good to see you again, Mrs. Withers. Please, come in, have a seat. What can we do for you today? He listened with respectful attention as I explained my situation. I spoke slowly, measuring my words, laying out the facts without bitterness. I told him about my children's request, about the power of attorney, about my worries, not just about money, but about agency and dignity. I want to make sure, I said, that my decisions remain my own for as long as I am able, and when the time comes, I'd like the things I've saved to serve a purpose, not just to be divided up like a pie. He nodded, scribbling notes, sometimes pausing to clarify a detail or offer a gentle suggestion. You're wise to think ahead, Mrs. Withers. May I ask, do you have a particular plan for your assets? I hesitated, then handed him a clipping from my purse, a page torn from the local paper describing the Second Spring Foundation, a fund dedicated to helping older women start businesses and build independent lives after retirement or widowhood. I'd like to support something like this, and I'd like to revoke any old powers of attorney, set new instructions, close my joint accounts, quietly, no drama. He studied the article, then looked up at me with something like respect. That's absolutely possible. It will take a few signatures, some paperwork, but I can walk you through every step. You're not the first client to feel pressure from family. We can protect your wishes, Mrs. Withers. We spent more than an hour together. He went over every clause, every possibility. We reviewed my accounts, my will, my wishes in careful, methodical detail. I signed a revocation of the old, informal documents. No more blanket permissions, no more just-in-case signatures. Everything would now require my explicit consent, my living, present voice. Next came the transfer of my major assets, my retirement fund, the apartment, the savings account, into a long-term charitable trust. managed with the specific aim of supporting women like the one I'd seen sweeping out the bakery this morning. Mr. Myers explained the details, outlining the safeguards. The money would generate annual grants to help women over 60 start their own small businesses. Any residual funds after my lifetime would continue to support the cause. It was my way of giving back and of making sure that all those years of saving wouldn't just buy someone a new car or pay off a hasty loan. They'd become bread, new dresses, hope, second chances. By the time we finished, the clouds had burned off outside, and sunlight streamed through the high windows of his office. I stood, my knees a little stiff, but lighter than I'd felt in weeks. As Mr. Myers walked me out, he paused. "You've made some brave decisions, Mrs. Withers. If you need anything, anything at all, you have my card." I thanked him, pocketing the crisp envelope of documents, feeling the weight of them, a different kind of weight this time, more like armor than burden. On the way home, I stopped at the bank. The manager was new, a young man, careful and professional. I explained what I needed, the closure of the old joint account, new arrangements in my name only. He processed everything briskly, only pausing to ask if I wanted a new debit card or online access. I declined, preferring my old ways. I signed the forms with a steady hand, every J in my name looping confidently. Before I left, I paused at the counter and withdrew $50 in crisp notes. I tucked one into the bakery tip jar on my way past and bought a single perfect yellow rose from the florist across the street. It sat bright in my shopping bag, a small symbol of what was possible when you chose your own life. When I finally reached home, I locked the door behind me, set my documents in the safe, and brewed a cup of tea. I sat at my table, sunlight warming my face, and looked around at the apartment that was, still, truly mine. No notice given, no announcement, just a quiet official reclaiming of myself. The week passed with a rare, unexpected lightness. The burden that had pressed down on my shoulders for months, maybe years, had lifted. I found myself humming again as I went about the little chores of the day. I moved more slowly, but not out of weariness, more out of the careful pleasure of reclaiming my home, my time. For a few days, neither Mark nor Katie called. There were no emails, no surprise visits, just the steady rhythm of ordinary life. I wondered if they were giving me space, or if perhaps they were quietly certain that the right decision was just around the corner. I let them have their quiet just as I took mine. I spent my mornings tending the yellow roses and reading the paper in my sunlit kitchen, circling stories about women who'd reinvented themselves after 70, underlining little lines of poetry with a soft pencil. Sometimes, as I sliced apples for pie or wiped down the counters, I found myself smiling. I wrote a letter to Mrs. Henley from the bakery, enclosing a clipping about the Second Spring Foundation and wishing her luck in her new venture. I had never done such things before, never felt the impulse to be involved, to reach beyond my little apartment. But now, I felt a sort of kinship with these women. Ordinary lives, long years, and yet a new beginning possible at any moment. On Friday, just after lunch, my phone rang. Katie's number flashed across the screen. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice too bright. "Are you home this afternoon? Mark and I thought we'd swing by, just to check in and see if you have any questions about the papers." I said yes, of course. I spent the next hour putting the house in order, not out of nervousness, but habit. I straightened the tablecloth, set out cups for tea, and placed the envelope of legal documents, my documents, back in the desk drawer, tucked away beneath a folder marked Letters. At 3:30, they arrived together. I watched from my window as Mark parked his car, sleek, new, still faintly smelling of dealership plastic. Katie emerged from her little hybrid, juggling her handbag, a notebook, and a manila folder. They met at the building's entrance, conferring quietly before coming up. The doorbell rang. I opened the door and greeted them with a calm smile, stepping aside as they entered. Mark looked determined. Katie rehearsed. Both seemed relieved to see me in good spirits. Mark took the lead, as if on cue. Hey, Mom. Hope we're not interrupting. Did you get a chance to look at the paperwork? Katie set her folder down and slid into her usual chair, already opening the stack of documents she'd brought. We tried to make everything as simple as possible, Mom. Really, once you sign, you won't have to worry about a thing. They both looked at me with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, as if my signature would set some invisible machinery in motion. I poured the tea, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who had practiced hospitality all her life. I placed the sugar bowl between them, let the spoons clink in their cups. Mark pushed a pen toward me. We spoke to a lawyer, too. Everything's in order. All that's left is your signature, Mom. For a moment, I looked at the pen, turning it in my fingers. I saw a flicker of hope in their eyes. Hope, but also something like impatience. I set the pen down gently. You're already a little late, I said, meeting their eyes with quiet steadiness. It's all done. Just not for you. For a beat, no one spoke. Mark blinked, confusion flickering over his face. Katie's lips parted as if to protest, but no sound came out. Mark recovered first. What do you mean, Mom? You did what? I smiled, a soft and genuine smile, the kind I'd learned over many years of being asked things I already knew the answer to. I spoke to my lawyer. I've taken care of everything. My assets are accounted for, and my wishes are legally protected. There's no need for a power of attorney. Katie's face tightened. But, Mom, we just want to make sure you're safe, that you don't have to worry about all these details. I know you do, darling, I replied. But it's my job to worry about my own details. I'm not ready to hand over that job. Maybe I never will be. They exchanged glances, but I didn't let them interrupt. I also made other arrangements. There's no joint account to manage. There's no access to grant. I've left instructions, clear and binding, for everything I own. If something happens to me, well, it's all spelled out. But until then, I live my life, and I spend or give as I see fit. I watched as the news settled in, a slow understanding dawning. Mark's shoulders slumped. He stared at the table, jaw clenched, as if trying to recalculate some private math. Katie looked, for the first time in years, like a little girl caught sneaking biscuits from the jar, not because she was malicious, but because she thought she'd known best. I kept my tone gentle, though I knew I could never make this easy for them. I love you both. I always have. But this is mine. It's the last thing that's truly mine. There was silence, long and deep. Mark broke it with a sigh. I guess there's nothing more to talk about then. Katie gathered her papers, her motions careful. She paused at the door, her eyes searching mine for a trace of anger or hurt, but I only smiled and reached for her hand. I'm still your mother. I just want to be treated like one, not like a client or a project. They left in silence, the same way they had entered. Their steps on the stairs sounded heavier than before, as if they carried a weight they had not expected. When the door closed behind them, I let myself exhale. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from release. I went to the window and watched as they drove away, Mark's car following Katie's out of the lot. I wondered what they would say to each other, what new story would be written about what Mom did. But here, in my own quiet rooms, I felt only peace. I put the kettle on again, the kitchen filling with steam and sunlight. My phone chimed, a new email. I opened it to find a note from the Second Spring Foundation. Dear Mrs. Withers, we're delighted to inform you that your first grant has been awarded. A bakery run by a woman I'd never met would open its doors this spring. A life changed, not just managed. I smiled to myself and raised my cup, toasting the sunlit window and the wild yellow roses on the balcony. For the first time in years, I felt utterly, truly free. The silence that followed their departure lingered in the apartment like the echo of a slammed door. For a long time after Mark and Katie left, I stood by the window, one hand resting on the sill, the other cradling my cooling teacup. I watched the sun slide behind the rooftops, the clouds rolling in with the promise of rain. Below, the last cars of the evening rattled by, headlights flickering across the wet street. My children's absence felt physical, like a shift in the air, a hollowness where their noise and presence had just been. But under that, I felt something else, a strange, bracing relief, sharp as cold water. I had done it. I had held my ground. I had said, in my own way, enough. For the rest of the evening, I kept busy, wiping down the counters, folding laundry, writing a shopping list I didn't really need. It was as if I were reclaiming each small task, reminding myself that the ordinary rhythms of my life were still mine to arrange. But every so often, the stillness pressed in and doubts crept at the edges of my mind. Had I been too harsh, too abrupt? Would they think I didn't love them, or that I didn't trust them? The old worry gnawed at me, a habit born of years spent smoothing over every argument, sacrificing my own comfort for theirs. I paused at my bookshelf, brushing dust from a row of photo albums. Here was Mark at 12, standing beside a model airplane, grinning with crooked teeth. Here was Katie, all freckles and braids, clutching a trophy at her school spelling bee. Here were birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesday nights filled with laughter and spilled juice. So many memories, moments of giving, of caretaking, of love expressed in casseroles and clean laundry, quiet encouragement and patient listening. Had they really not noticed? Had I hidden myself so well all those years that they could mistake caution for frailty, generosity for naivete? As evening deepened, a message buzzed on my phone. It was from Mark. Mom, I don't understand why you don't trust us. We just wanted to help. I hope you're okay. I stared at the words for a long moment. The impulse was there, to call back, to explain, to soothe, but something in me held back. I realized that for once, I didn't need to defend my decision. I could let it stand, silent and solid, like the foundation of the house I'd built for them and for myself. Katie didn't call. Instead, late that night, an email appeared in my inbox, long, anxious, full of half-formed questions and careful phrasing. If something happens, how will we know what to do? What if you forget things, Mom? What if you need us and we're not ready? Reading it, I remembered the night after Leonard's funeral, when the house was too quiet and the future too vast. Katie had been the one to come and sit at the edge of my bed, her young face streaked with tears, her hand in mine. "I'll look after you, Mom," she'd whispered. "You looked after us. Now it's our turn." Was this her way of keeping that promise? Of turning love into management, care into oversight? I wrote back, my response brief but gentle. "You'll always know what to do, Katie. I trust you, but I need to finish my own story first. Love, Mom." I hit send and closed the computer. The rain had begun to fall in earnest now, pattering softly on the balcony outside. I turned off the lights and walked slowly through the quiet rooms, touching the backs of chairs, the cool porcelain of the bathroom sink, the quilt folded at the foot of my bed. Everything was as it should be, unremarkable, undramatic, mine. That night, sleep came in fits and starts. I dreamed of the old garden at our first house, Leonard digging out dandelions while the children chased each other through the grass. I remembered my mother's hands, strong and deft, always making do, always mending and preparing and providing. She had died with little in the bank, but dignity in every breath. Was I like her or different? Was dignity something you inherited or something you fought for again and again? In the morning, the air was clear, the world washed clean. I poured my tea, found the letter from the Second Spring Foundation on the counter, and reread it twice, each word a gentle anchor to the present. Your grant has enabled us to provide a new start for Mrs. Lorna Espinoza, who has opened her bakery in Southgate. She sends her thanks and would love to meet you if you're ever nearby. I smiled at the thought. A woman I'd never met, flower-dusted and proud, building something from the quiet generosity of a stranger. My legacy, such as it was, would be more than numbers in a ledger. It would be bread, laughter, the scent of cinnamon and yeast, the courage to begin again. Late that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. I half expected to find Mark or Katie, ready for one more attempt at persuasion. Instead, it was Mrs. Henley from the bakery, holding a warm bag of rolls and a handwritten note. Thank you for thinking of us. When women help each other, the world becomes a little kinder. Come by any time. We always have coffee brewing. I invited her in, and we sat in the sunlit kitchen, sharing the soft rolls and stories. We spoke of small victories, old hardships, and the ways we surprised ourselves by beginning anew. When she left, I stood for a while on the balcony, the city stretching out below, the roses nodding in the breeze. I thought of my children, grown, capable, learning their own lessons in love and control. I wished them patience. I wished them courage. I wished them the slow, quiet certainty that had only now, in this season of my life, come to me. And in the peace of that moment, I understood. I had trusted them until they started talking to me like I was a deposit to be protected. But I was more than that, and always had been. I was a woman who had learned to give, and now, finally, to choose whom she gave to. The days that followed unfolded quietly, like a gentle thaw after a long frost. The tension of the previous weeks, papers on the table, anxious voices on the phone, the constant press of someone else's plans, seemed to recede with every passing morning. In its place, there was a lightness I hadn't expected, a freedom to simply inhabit my own life again. I returned to my routines with a new attention. The warm mug between my palms as I sat at the kitchen table, the slow trimming of the yellow roses on the balcony, the careful folding of laundry in the sunlit bedroom. But these were no longer habits to fill an empty day. They were small acts of stewardship, reminders that my home, my time, my choices belonged to me. Mark called once more, a few days after his last message. He sounded subdued, almost hesitant, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "Hi, Mom, just checking in. You doing all right?" I heard the unspoken question behind his words. "Are you angry? Have you closed the door for good?" I answered as simply and warmly as I could. "I'm well, Mark. Really. I hope you are, too. Let's not make this into a drama, all right? I love you. You're still my son, and I'm still your mother, just as I've always been." He was silent for a moment, then said, "Yeah, I guess I needed to hear that. Katie does, too." We talked of small things, the weather, Madison's school project, the old neighbor who'd finally moved to Florida. He didn't bring up the power of attorney or the trust, and I didn't offer details. It was enough for now. Katie stopped by on a Sunday, just before dinner. She brought Madison, who darted into the living room with a whirlwind of stories about a baking contest at school. I hugged her, savoring the honest energy of her embrace. Katie lingered at the kitchen table while Madison read in the corner, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the tablecloth. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said at last, not quite meeting my eyes. "We just wanted to do the right thing. I know it didn't feel that way to you. I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. You're a good daughter, Katie. You worry because you care. I get that. But sometimes love is letting go. It's letting people stand on their own, even when you think you know best. She smiled, a little crooked smile that I remembered from her childhood when she was trying not to cry. I was scared, she admitted. I didn't want you to be alone or lost. I didn't want to fail you. I squeezed her hand. I've never been lost, Katie. Not really. And you haven't failed me. You're learning, just like I am, how to let people be themselves. We talked quietly while the kettle sang, and when we sat down for tea, Madison joined us, brightening the room with her laughter and her stories about a classmate's disastrous attempt at a 3-layer cake. I watched them together, mother and daughter, learning new ways to care for each other, and felt, for the first time in a long while, that we might find our way through this. After they left, the apartment felt fuller, not emptier. Their voices echoed gently in the hallway, not as accusation, but as reassurance that love could survive even a few hard truths. That evening, I found myself drawn to the letter from the Second Spring Foundation once again. I read it slowly, letting the words settle. Thanks to your generosity, we have helped 3 women this spring alone: Mrs. Espinosa's bakery, Ms. Walker's tailoring shop, and Mrs. Chan's vegetable stall. Each of these women has written to say how your grant has changed their lives, giving them purpose, pride, and community. Attached was a photograph. 3 women standing together in front of a sunlit storefront, arms around each other, eyes bright with hope. There was flour on Mrs. Espinosa's cheek, a tape measure slung over Ms. Walker's neck, and a small crate of tomatoes in Mrs. Chan's hands. I traced their faces with my finger, feeling an unfamiliar surge of kinship. My savings, my rainy day fund, had become someone else's spring. Days slipped into weeks. I grew braver, venturing out to visit Mrs. Espinosa's bakery one bright afternoon. The shop was fragrant with cinnamon and vanilla, and Mrs. Espinosa herself came from behind the counter, her hands warm and soft as she clasped mine. Mrs. Withers, you are a miracle, she said, her voice catching. I never thought I'd have this, never. Thank you for believing in women like us. I bought a loaf of challah and a box of scones, staying for coffee as we talked about everything and nothing. There was no need for explanations or speeches. We spoke the quiet language of women who had worked, saved, sacrificed, and finally shared. Word spread quietly, as it always does in small towns. I received a note from the community center inviting me to speak to a group of older women about the foundation. I almost refused. Public speaking was never my strength. But then I remembered the courage it had taken to sign those papers in the lawyer's office. I accepted. My voice trembled at first, but the faces before me were patient and kind. I spoke not just about money, but about dignity, agency, and the importance of writing your own ending. In the evenings, I sometimes caught myself sitting with a glass of tea, staring at the city lights and letting my mind drift, not to worry, but to quiet satisfaction. The world kept turning. Bills still arrived, groceries still needed buying, the roses demanded their careful tending, but everything was different because everything was mine. There were moments of doubt, of course. Habits and guilt are hard to break, but I found a kind of strength in solitude, a space where memory was not a weight, but a tapestry, colorful and whole. Mark and Katie called more often now, not to check up or ask for signatures, but to share news, invite me for Sunday lunches, or simply to talk. We learned new boundaries together, sometimes awkward, but always moving forward. They seemed to understand, slowly, that my independence was not a rejection, but a legacy, a lesson for them as much as for me. One rainy night, I sat at my kitchen table with the lights low and the rain tapping at the window. I thought of Leonard, of the children as babies, of every coupon clipped and penny saved, of the patient years spent making do. I smiled, thinking of how all that carefulness had blossomed into something bold and surprising at the end. In that quiet, I realized that this was not the last chapter. Not really. It was just the first one I'd written entirely for myself. I raised my cup to the window, to the world beyond, to the women I'd helped, and the daughter I was still learning to trust. To myself, a woman not spent, but transformed. They had wanted to manage my money. I had given it, instead, to those who could not take it, but create with it. And in that simple, ordinary room, I understood. Sometimes the best legacy is not what you leave behind, but what you start, quietly, confidently, while you're still here.